All right, so let me get this part started. Um, this will last about an hour, 55 minutes. I'll try to stop right at the hour. Um, it is Brain Talk with Jim is going to be a session that will happen periodically, typically once or twice a month going forward. Loving Your Child's Brain is a course that starts next week at this same time. Um, and runs for an hour each week for 8 weeks. And so I'm going to talk about loving your child's brain and give you an in-depth overview of what that's about so you can decide for yourself if it's something that you would like to uh, basically do for your child. And don't, it works for adults too, but don't tell anyone. Uh, so just a little bit about my background. Um, I I'm strange. I have a BS in physics, a master's degree in engineering management, a master's degree in psychotherapy, and I'm an Amen Clinic's brain health professional. Um, those things don't go together really, but somehow it works. I spent 10 years plus as a psychotherapist, 25 years studying SPECT imaging and brain science, which I'm passionate about, 35 years as an engineer and manager, 10 years as an educator. And at the age of about 7, I fell out of a tree. Actually, I didn't fall out, I dropped out. I was hanging, I let go, and I was just supposed to land on my feet on the ground. I woke up in the bottom of a hole filled with broken concrete and unconscious after being unconscious. And from that time, pretty much I was suffered from severe depression. Never told anybody about falling out of the tree, never told anybody about the depression until much later in life. Um, that went untreated for 27 years. And then I went through a divorce and was suicidal. And I had 3 doctors tell me that I needed to take medication, which I finally did. A month later, I decided that life didn't suck. It made that big a difference in my outlook on life. Um, so I was 13 years of medicated depression, but it just took the edge off. It didn't really make me better. Um, I had a mental breakdown um, later in life, kind of after all of this, and went through the ringer of of psychiatric treatment um, and basically subsequently have recovered from that. But I definitely got a deep appreciation for and compassion for people who are struggling through psychiatric kinds of illnesses. So, what you should get out of this, it says series. I used the slides from the course, so sometimes it may sound a little funny, but I want you to get brain envy for yourself and for your child. Um, I want you to build. You should get out of this the tools to build resilience for your child from things like killing ants, and ants are automatic negative thoughts. I'll give you at least 3 different ways to do that in the course. A respect for the delicateness of the brain and the desire to protect it, and an understanding that brain issues um, an understanding of brain issues, brain physiology a little bit, and how they impact your child's life. This is not a deep science uh, class today or in the course, but you'll get some of that just so that you have a better understanding of what's going on. Again, what you should get out of to not necessarily all today, but out of the series is care and feeding of your child's brain, better relationships, better for your child, better decisions, happier, healthier, more cooperative. Oftentimes, things that look like behavior problems are really just brain issues that can easily be solved, um, and options for treating the brain, both medication, but really more towards the natural approach of supplements, which I don't sell, um, and lifestyle changes that can be um, added to your child's life that will make a huge difference in their resilience and their ability to cope. Uh, you'll get a feeling for how untreated brain issues can lead to serious consequences both in life and health, and how to turn those things around. I really geared things towards prevention rather than treatment in as much as I can, and understanding that most issues are not just one thing but several. And the good news that no matter what's gone on, what issues you and your child are dealing with, they can be made better, um, and a lot more. So we talked about it really. Healthier, happier kids, the ability to do what they want in life, more successful in school, more successful in life, better relationships, more resilient, better able to cope and thrive, happier, healthier in old age, even. That's one of the things that's really important to me is we'll see later that the lifespan of a child born today is crazy long. And the illnesses of old age that we suffer with now in someone like that would be horrible, because they would be just a huge section of half their life in some cases. We'll talk about things that sound a little scary at first, but it's really things like this happen not necessarily at a clinical level, but sometimes at a subclinical level where it's just making life hard for you or your child. Um, whether whether it's something like they're just sad all the time, they're not depressed, but they're sad, or they're anxious, or they're scared. Those things can be addressed with um, the tools that I'll give you. So we'll have an introduction and brain, sort of to brain physiology and science. We'll talk about brain trauma, toxic exposure, which is, little kids eat everything, right? Um, especially the ones that are crawling on the floor. Uh, we'll talk about drugs and alcohol, um, the prefrontal cortex, and what happens when you don't have good prefrontal cortex um, function. And prefrontal cortex is just this part in the front of your head that, or actually in the picture I can point, that is what makes you human. It's 30% in a human brain. It's 6% in a dog's brain. So um, kind of get, or 13% in a chimpanzee's brain. It's a really big part of what makes you human. And we'll talk about that a little bit even today. Um, but the basal ganglia, which is another part of the brain that you can't see in this picture, that's responsible for things like anxiety. We'll talk about the things that lead to PTSD and how to treat it. Several different approaches that are all um, it's very treatable. Depression and the limbic system, the anterior cingulate gyrus, which is a big set of words, but really is just a part of this frontal part of your brain. It's kind of like if you had a mohawk inside your head, and it's the gear shifter in your brain that allows you to go from thought to thought or task to task. It's responsible for people who it's what's responsible for things like obsessive compulsive disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, and that sort of thing. And again, it doesn't have to be clinical. It can just be you have a really stubborn person that's argumentative, and if you treat that, those things get easier both for them and for you. It's hard to be argumentative. We'll talk about the autism spectrum and coordination that kind of result from issues with the cerebellum, which is here in the back, and anger, violence, and memory in the temporal lobes, which is here. Oops, I'm pointing to the wrong screen. It's here. Cerebellum is here. Temporal lobes are here. Frontal lobes. We won't talk about the parietal lobes or the occipital lobes much at all. So we'll also talk about care and feeding of your brain, including diet, um, killing ants, I mentioned before, obesity. If you are, if your child is carrying extra weight, it is causing their brain to actually shrink. And when it comes to the brain and function, size matters. So that's an important thing to address. We'll talk about some more serious issues like bipolar and schizophrenia, um, and how I'll talk a lot about SPEC imaging, and I'll get to that in a minute. But basically, it's an imaging technique that I use to illustrate most of this stuff that allows you to actually see what's going on inside the brain, what happens when the medication or supplements are working, and can encourage people to follow treatment, because once you see these, you want a better brain, and um, it just makes it so much easier. We'll talk about targeted diet, exercise, meditation. Hopefully, I'll get to the pictures at the end here that show SPECT images of people, of a person meditating who has PTSD, and you can see right in front of you that it makes the brain better. Um, Targeted supplements, different condition for different conditions and more. And there'll be a few surprises along the way. So mental health, brain health is a big deal. The brain, um, the brain-related problems affect 200 million Americans, and it's 1.1 billion people worldwide. And there are things like brain fog and memory problems, which happen in childhood sometimes and happen in old age more often. They shouldn't be a normal thing. It actually should be that we take care of our brain across our lifetime, so those things don't happen. We'll talk about depression and anxiety, insomnia, um, attentional issues, and again, being overweight or obese. I, you guys haven't seen a brain spec scan yet. Anybody want to take a guess as to whether this is a good brain or a bad brain? Healthy, I should say healthy or not healthy?
Maybe unhealthy because it looks porous.
Very good. Thank you. You're absolutely right. um, we'll get to those in a second. Anybody have any questions at this point?
No, I'm fine.
Okay, I'll move on. You'll get more chances, and you can interrupt me if at any time. I should have said that in the beginning. So module one talks about the introduction, which we'll talk about here. Bump on the head. Is it a bump on the head or a traumatic brain injury? There are no real mild brain injuries, and I would classify them not as mild, medium, and severe, but mild, medium, severe, and catastrophic. The people who have been in IED accidents in Iraq and Iran have suffered catastrophic brain injuries in a lot of cases. It's much more difficult to heal those. But people who have had even severe brain injuries, there's a protocol that can help heal that and make it better, even decades after they've been injured. So we'll talk about that sort of thing. Um, we'll talk about we're going to have an introduction to SPECT imaging, why a bump on the head can be serious, how to heal even even severe traumatic brain injuries, which I just mentioned. Today we won't talk about it, but in the course we'll talk about the Amen Clinic's 4 circles approach to treatment, which basically treats psychological, biological, um, physical, and spiritual aspects of a person's life. Spiritual doesn't mean religious. It's more having a meaning in life and having some tie to what's important in your life than that. Okay, so warning signs that
I'm
your child.
sorry. There
Yes.
is a question from Marky.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question about the when you were talking about the types of brain. Is there a subject about narcissist's brain?
Narcissist. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't talk about personality disorder per se.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I actually don't have a lot of information, period, on personality disorders, even though I have lived with them. Uh, but there's something that I could look into and perhaps give more information about.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Jim,
Yes,
can you make your volume just a little bit louder, please?
I wish I could. I'm up as high as
Oh,
I can go, I think.
okay.
You
All
may
right,
be able
thank
to,
you.
sorry, you may be able to raise it on your end.
I can't, but thank you. I mean, I
Okay.
have.
Okay, sorry.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll try to yell more. I'll project. So, warning signs that your child's brain might be in trouble, or is it working well? If there's been memory changes over the past year, low energy, low mood, irritability, and you might say already be saying, well, it's been a year of COVID, so of course there's all those things have happened, including irritability and anxiety and stress and worry. Um, those things are real and they're affecting the person's brain, your child's brain. Every thought that we have triggers chemical release, whether it's good thoughts or bad thoughts, triggers good chemical release or a bad chemical release. And so, those things really need to be addressed. Short attention span is another, brain fog, being impulsive and then making bad decisions. I would say, in general, making a bad decision, especially if you're a kid, is not a sign of a problem. Making the same bad decision is probably an issue. um, Issues with insomnia, aggression, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, weight issues, both too high and too low, age inappropriate sexual behavior. I'm talking about kids across the spectrum. I classify kids as from conception to 90 years old. Kind of depends on what you have, um, who you have in your life. Because this stuff applies to everyone. Non-compliant for health, they won't follow what's been given them, and changes in any of the above. Okay, so your child's brain and skull. Skull is very hard and filled with sharp ridges, especially these right here where your temporal lobe sits. We'll talk about that. Temporal lobe is this kind of pontoon shaped structure that sits on either side of your brain. Sits right there in that sharp area. Skull is hard. Brain is about the consistency of soft butter, maybe tofu, or an egg white, not raw, but a hard-boiled egg, the egg white there. It If you get hit in front, it has a tendency to rattle around inside your brain, so back and forth. So you may end up with damage in the front and the back. If you get hit in the side, it hits both sides often. So that's something to think about. And we'll talk about contact sports later. Okay, so I talk a lot about Spec Scans because they're amazing. Um, it basically looks at how the brain works as opposed to um, an MRI or a CT scan. It's looking at blood flow and brain activity. It tells whether the brain is working well, too hard, or not hard enough. So that's basically what we're looking at. It is a medical imaging study that uses a radioactive tracer. Um, and the machine doesn't fall from the sky, I promise, but it it basically looks like this. Your head is all that goes in the machine. This structure, there are three heads to the three camera heads, and they rotate around your head. It takes about 15 minutes to do a scan, and they kind of immobilize your head so that you don't move. And that's basically it for a scan. Typically, they do two scans, one at rest and one after concentration or during concentration. And I discovered that they really had a good way to make you concentrate. Um, was very frustrating for me. So SPEC can diagnose all kinds of things, resistant emotional, behavioral, or cognitive issues. And I really believe that behavioral issues are most of the time a cognitive or a brain issue. They can see memory and depression, dementia issues, traumatic brain injuries, and concussions where MRIs don't show any damage at all. Behavioral problems. Actually, I've had several MRIs that could see nothing in my brain, but I've had at least 3 traumatic brain injuries that I know of that showed up very visibly on SPECT, and you see those actually not today, but in the course. It shows behavioral problems. Um, it shows aggression, addiction. There are 6 types actually, which help in treating addictions. There are 5 types of overeaters, which helps to address diet and dieting issues. It looks at the autism spectrum disorders and can distinguish them, again, to help address diagnosis, not address treatment. ADD or ADHD, I kind of use the 2 interchangeably. It's not 2 things, it's 7 things. And SPECT can distinguish those. Mood and anxiety disorders, there are actually 7 types, from major depression to bipolar, including anxiety. Schizophrenia. For schizophrenia, it's more important for helping someone see what their brain looks like, that they might want to do something to help make it move towards normal or healthy, and they can see what it looks like when they take medication. So they say, oh my gosh, I want to continue. Again, not necessarily something that your child is likely to suffer, but schizophrenia, typical onset is about 27. Um, so it is something of interest for older children, if you will. There are differentiated types and subtypes of disorder previously thought to be one thing, and I've listed most of them here. Okay, so a healthy brain should look like this. This is the top, looking from the top down. This is the front. Oops, I got to point over here. So this is top down, the front, the back, and so since this is the front, see if I can do this right. This is the left and this is the right. This is a surface scan. You can see how smooth it looks. The color means nothing. It's just to help you visualize the contour. This is a deep scan from the same view. This is the cerebellum, and you can see that it's bright. It's working hard, which is what should be the case for a normal or healthy scan. That's always the part of the brain that's working the hardest. It's got, I think it's got almost as many neurons as the rest of the brain combined. And it's responsible for things like coordination of your body physically, as well as thought speed and thought coordination. Then this is a deep scan from the bottom up, active scan, and you can see the cerebellum again. Looks like a nice big smile, and it's nothing else hot in here. It's nice and cool. Everything looks good. This is from the bottom up surface scan. When we go to the bottom up, left is right and right is left because we flipped it upside down. Again, so this is the front and this is the back. Sorry about that. So those were healthy scans. And what it does, what SPEC scans can do is decrease stigma because it's not a mental illness per se, it's a brain health issue. It increases compliance with treatment. Patients and families see problems as medical, not moral or on purpose, volitional. It dramatically decreases shame, guilt, anger, self-loathing, and the like. It increases forgiveness and compassion. You don't see somebody as being a brat. You see them as having a brain problem that can be addressed, can be treated. And there's nothing else in psychiatry that's this powerful. Unfortunately, psychiatry in general, they don't look at the object that they treat. They make pretty good guesses, but there's no substitute for being able to see what's going on. All other doctors are able to look at what they do. Cardiologists, you name a profession or a sub a subfield of medicine, and they look at what they treat. This allows psychiatrists to look at what they treat. Here is an example of a drug-addicted brain before and after medication. And you don't have to be a brain scientist to see the difference. The holes are filled in. Remember, holes are not holes per se. They're areas of the brain that aren't working well, aren't working as up to speed. And this is typical, these holes in the front are typical of ADD. We'll see that later. And so when it comes to the brain, blood flow is king. And you want to, there are different ways you can increase blood flow. Exercise is one of the top ones. When you exercise, it increases blood flow to your brain by 15%. Cold exposure is not something you'd think about for your kids necessarily, but it does help. Sunlight, ginkgo biloba is a cheap supplement that increases blood flow. No side effects that I know of. Low-level laser therapy is another one that helps increase blood flow. Vinpocetine is another inexpensive supplement. It's a little hard to find, but it's relatively inexpensive and works to increase blood flow. Excuse me. Meditation both increases blood flow to the brain, the prefrontal cortex, as well as the as well as increases resilience when practiced over time. Resveratrol increases blood flow. Dark chocolate in moderation, greater than 70% cacao, cocoa, cacao, whatever it is. I'm not a chocolate fan. I'm weird. Is good. You don't want sugar in it. Sugar is not necessarily good. Actually, it's pretty bad for the brain in general, which is hard with kids. Omega-3 fatty acids, which everybody's talking about now. And there's two components to omega-3 fatty acids. There's EPA, which is an excitatory part of omega-3s, and there's DHA, which is a calming part. And depending on what is going on inside your brain, you want them to be higher or lower relative to each other. And we talk about that in particular for different brain issues. Acupuncture raises blood flow to the brain. Chewing gum, again, preferably sugar-free. Acetyl L-carnitine is a relatively inexpensive amino acid. Nitrates from vegetables like beet juice. Caffeine is bad. It decreases blood flow to the brain. Paracetam is a substance that increases blood flow and helps kind of boost mental capacity in general. A ketogenic diet, but not for everyone. And we'll see an example of that today. And then music. And again, kind of depends on the music. So questions at this point? Yes,
Hi
Ramiko?
Jim, what kind of music is better for the brain to increase the blood from the increase in the blood flow perspective?
So the best brain music, if you will, is Mozart. Um, and there are others that are good, but in general, the research has found that Mozart promotes blood flow, promotes focus, and relaxation all at the same time.
So do you mean by classic?
Yes, the classics. So Mozart in particular, as a composer, for some reason, had it down. Was very good at.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh.
I have a question about the keiko diet, or if it
Yes.
is, if you can, because you mentioned that it is not for everyone. Can you specify?
Yes, in particular, people who have type 3 ADD, which I'll talk about here in a minute, um, they can become um, mean on a high protein diet.
I see. Thank you.
Uh-huh. Anyone else? I'm not sure I see everyone. I was hoping I could do that, but I'm going to go forward. If you had a question, just unmute your mic and let me have it. We saw these before. I just wanted to point out frontal lobe here in, whoops, wrong place. Frontal lobe in yellow, temporal lobe in blue, cerebellum here in pink at the bottom. Um, those are three areas of the brain we'll talk about in specific. And then in this view, we will talk about the cingulate gyrus, and particularly this part. We'll touch on the hypothalamus maybe a little bit, and the cerebellum again. And that's pretty much it. It's not a lot of other brain function or brain parts that we'll deal with in this class today and in the course. So there's not a lot of deep science, but you will learn a fair amount. Okay, brain trauma. I hate it when this happens. Football is not a brain-friendly sport. Typical NFL player, by the time they're retired, they have suffered the order of 30,000 traumatic brain injuries. And the Amen Clinics has done a research project with active and retired NFL players and has developed a treatment program protocol for recovering what has been lost due to those brain injuries. And it's, I'll give you a spoiler. It is basically weight loss, diet, exercise, supplements, and hyperbaric oxygen therapy. Okay, is it just a bump on the head or a traumatic brain injury? If your child is hit in the head and there's a change in behavior, personality, functioning, regardless of whether they lost consciousness or even had a bruise, it's important to get professional help. And if you go to the standard doctor, They're going to do an MRI and they're going to say there's nothing wrong, which may or may not be true. And it can be treated regardless of how long it was ago, and you can get, they can get markedly better. I'm going to give you an example next of Tim. And so you get a feel for this, but basically you want to watch your child, especially after a bump on the head, or even if you don't know, like me, if someone would have been watching me and noticed that all of a sudden I went from being happy-go-lucky to being kind of down all the time, they might have figured out that I was depressed. It can, also it can happen up to a year after the event. So Tim, at age 15, was suffering from conduct disorder problems or conduct problems. He was arrested for shoplifting. He frequently cut school. He was defiant and abusive towards his parents. He didn't get along with others, didn't really fit in. He had fallen down the stairs at the age of 18 months, and his mom said he had never been the same. A combination of anticonvulsant medications and a stimulant lessened the rage and improved his impulse control. Now, Tim's case was long before the NFL study, so they didn't know as much about supplements and diet and hyperbaric oxygen. But that's what could be done in the sort of medication era. You can see his brain trauma is dramatic here. And again, it's easy to tell what's going on. You could look at this and all of a sudden have a lot of compassion for Tim instead of thinking that he was just a hoodlum. And that's, again, the power of SPECT imaging. So I mentioned this earlier. I didn't mention the numbers, but supposedly the lifespan of a child born today is expected to be the order of 130 years. And if brain health isn't taken seriously, they'll probably end up spending 60 or 70 years in some kind of warehouse for old people because they can't take care of themselves. And I know nobody wants that for their child. We just don't think about it now. And I want people to think about it and be proactive to make sure that doesn't happen. Or even if it does, it's pushed out in time as far as possible. Which kind of brings up kids in contact sports. Come on. There we go. Even minor blows to the head can cause problems in childhood or old age. Things like hitting a soccer ball are not healthy for a person's brain, let alone a child's that's developing and they have a nice soft head. Soccer would be a great sport without that particular, whatever you want to call it, being a legal play. You know, if it was no hands and no head, I'm all for it. The decision to play contact sports should be informed by the child's ApoE4 gene status, because if they're positive, their risk for dementia in later life is way too high, in my opinion. There are a lot of brain healthy sports. You know, you've got things like, you can look at the Olympics, right? There are things like fencing and racket sports and table tennis. There are martial arts, as long as they're not contact, you know, full contact, they can do things, but there's a lot of benefit in the discipline and body coordination and all of that. But if it's contact, it's not good. Dancing is excellent for coordination. It helps develop your cerebellum. Weightlifting is good unless you're doing bodybuilding, in which case when a bodybuilder's getting ready for a show, they dehydrate themselves, and dehydrating the brain is not good. The same goes for running. Running is great. Marathons are bad because of the same issue. Most track and field activities are great. Pole vaulting, I would say, is probably not. I watched my friend Herb break the pole too many times and land on his head in the box. And then sports that require a helmet do not make them safe, only safer. Helmets do not make your child invincible. I talk about more traditional parenting kinds of things, like the 5 love languages from Gary Chapman. The concept is basically that we all feel love in certain ways, and if someone tries to give us love in a different way, we miss. And my best example was a couple that I had when I was doing psychotherapy, and the couple had struggled financially their whole marriage. Yes, Ramiko.
No,
Oh,
no, no. I love this topic.
oh, okay. Um, the they had yeah, right. So they had struggled their whole life, their whole marriage financially, and her love language, or I should say his love language, was gifts. And so he bought her diamond earrings. Well, for one, they couldn't afford them. And two, her love language was acts of service. All she really wanted was for him to clean the gutters. They missed. And there was anger from her instead of being overjoyed, which is what he had hoped for. And the different types of love languages are quality time, words of affirmation, acts of service, physical touch, and gifts. And your child will have one or more of those that is more prominent. If you can figure that out, which is usually pretty easy, you just watch how they try to give you love. You can give it back that way and save a lot of um, hassle and a lot of hurt feelings. Because sometimes, like my example, you get hurt feelings instead. Module 2 is about toxic exposure and substance abuse in children, adolescents, and young adults. And, toxic exposure comes from so many things in so many forms. And I go through a fairly detailed list in the course. It often causes brain damage, which is usually reversible. Um, Unfortunately, you have to be worried about your child trying alcohol in grade school. Um, it's important to know that things like caffeine and nicotine cause brain damage by reducing blood flow to the brain, and learn ways to heal these things. Um, and I'll give you a hint, most of them can be healed with just time without them. It's in particular things like caffeine, nicotine, drugs, and alcohol. Substance abuse, you may be on the phone with poison control to start with, but uh, yeah, unfortunately, bugs are good. Uh, Makeup is not. Again, brain health, healthy brain scans look like this. This is what marijuana brains look like. These all look pretty much the same. They all have the signs of um, toxic exposure. Sorry, they all have the signs of ADD, which are these holes in the front in the prefrontal cortex. They all have some temporal lobe issues on either side here. And this looks like temporal lobe ADD, which it doesn't look like I'm going to have time to talk about today, unfortunately, looking at the clock. Um, so, and I want you to look at this. This is what a top-down scan looks like of a marijuana brain, or an alcohol brain, or a cocaine brain, or a methamphetamine brain, or a heroin brain. There's lots of holes. It's very irregular shaped, or it's just scalloped, which is a sign of toxic exposure. So no matter what marijuana does from a medical standpoint, it also is damaging the brain from a toxic exposure standpoint. So um, even if it's been prescribed, there are things to weigh out when using it. So this is an example of being on and off of marijuana, um, and you can see 1 month without marijuana doesn't look great, but 3 days of heavy marijuana, and you can see that the holes have opened up, making what would be like ADD worse. The temporal lobes look worse between the two, a little harder to see in the surface scan. But in the deep scan, without THC or without marijuana, the cerebellum looks great. There are some hot spots going on, as well as some depression, because the limbic system is hot here. But with 3 days of heavy use, it's calmed down all that stuff as far as the depression and maybe some anxiety is concerned. But the cerebellum is also gone. So this person is not going to be very coordinated. They're going to talk slow. They're going to think slow. They're going to basically not function like a healthy person would. If you look at the top scan again, you see this toxic exposure appearance, and you don't want that. Alcohol is scary to me. After seeing these images, this is a 38-year-old with 17 years of weekend use. You can see the toxic exposure look from the top down. From the bottom up, you can see what looks like ADD and temporal lobe problems over here. This other person, a 42-year-old with 22 years of daily use, it looks more like a candle that somebody took a blowtorch to, as far as I'm concerned. And these are probably extreme cases, and they say that a couple of drinks, normal sized drinks, are okay a week typically, but if it's more than that, you start to get into some areas that are pretty scary. And then there's hope, right? Healing from drugs and alcohol. This is during substance abuse, and this is a year after. This is during and after. You can see it's much smoother here, and this mess of holes is smaller. So even in a year, it's getting much better. It's not perfect, but it's better. And I wanted to talk about this a lot. I think it's not going to happen in 7 minutes or 6 minutes, but we'll start and see how it goes. I'm going to stop in about 3 minutes. And so the prefrontal cortex basically is what makes you human. And I'm going to talk about what it does when it's working well, when it's not working well, some myths and facts I talk about in the course, why it's paramount to treat it. I'll talk about ADD and ADHD, or just one or the other if you prefer. It's 7 things anyway. And that you can't treat all 7 the same way, because if you do, in some cases, the person can end up being psychotic as opposed to getting better. and talk about natural and medicinal ways to treat, as well as medication's effect on the brain. No, sorry, meditation effect on the brain, which I'm sure I will get to. Okay, prefrontal cortex is here. In the SPEC scan, it's here and here. So top of the brain, so it's in the front. The prefrontal cortex, when it's working well, is responsible for attention span, perseverance, judgment, impulse control, self-monitoring and supervision, problem solving, critical thinking, forward thinking, learning from experience, ability to feel and express emotion, uh, influences the limbic system, or that part of the brain that's more emotional, and it's responsible for empathy. And you can see I have my cop in the rearview mirror here. According to Dudley Moore, there's no better safety device than a cop in the rearview mirror. And that's kind of what the prefrontal cortex is for your brain. It's the cop in the rearview mirror that's telling you to do the right thing or encouraging you to do the right thing. Whereas when it's working poorly, you have a people tend to have a short attention span, distractibility, lack of perseverance, impulse control problems, hyperactivity, chronic lateness and poor time management, disorganization, procrastination, unavailability of emotions. And that's kind of an important one. It's not that they're just being annoying and uncooperative. They may actually not have the ability to have emotion. Misperceptions, poor judgment, trouble learning from experience, short-term memory problems, social and test anxiety. It can also have comorbidity, or things that happen at the same time or in conjunction with oppositional disorders, conduct disorders, anxiety, mood, addictions, soft addictions. Bipolar spectrum disorder is kind of hard to tell the difference between that and what's called ring of fire ADD, Tourette's disorder, and learning disorders. And I'm going to do this one and then I'm going to stop, because a lot of people say, well, I don't want to treat my child's ADD with medication. But if you don't treat it, it doesn't have to be with medication. It can be with supplements and lifestyle changes. Untreated ADD tends to lead to things like treatment-resistant depression, anxiety, school failures, not completing education, soft addiction, insomnia, irritability, temper, sexual dysfunction in later life, financial and impulsiveness, spending and job problems, marital problems, sexual addictions, STDs, motor vehicle accidents, and in some cases, incarceration. It's important. And I'm going to, let's see, there's too many to even just skip through. So what I want to make sure, actually, I'm going to escape and go to the end. So basically, this was an example, or an extended overview of what loving your child's brain is like. Loving your child's brain won't be so rushed. I apologize for that today. I overestimated what I could do. But if you go to cocreationstation.co/child, you can sign up. It's an 8-week course. It covers this kind of material in depth. It is, the first 15 to sign up was free. Unfortunately, I've had 15 people sign up already. It starts next Thursday at this same time. And I believe it's the best investment you can make for your child's future because it prepares them to do better in every aspect of their life, health, relationships, and from school performance to self-regulation. It's really important. And we have some time. I have some time if anybody wants to ask questions. And if you are needing to go, I understand that too. Well, you're welcome to all unmute your microphones and talk at the same time.
I don't have any questions, Jim, but thank you for your presentation.
You're very welcome. Thank you for attending.
I don't have any question neither, but thank you, Jim, for the great presentation. And it was easier to digest even for me as a second language having English, you know.
I'm glad.